Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kalman Weiser, and I'm the director of York University's Koshitsky Center for Jewish Studies. It's my great pleasure today to welcome you to today's event, Jewish Environmentalism in Israel, a Shared Moment, with our guest speaker, Professor Tanhum Yoreh of the University of Toronto's School of the Environment. Professor Yoreh's talk is part of Climate Month, organized by research centers here at York University. And I'd like to tell you that York has a long-standing relationship with Professor Yoreh. We're very proud of one of our graduates. Professor Yoreh's first book about Jewish environmentalism is itself a result of research he conducted while a doctoral student affiliated with York Center for Jewish Studies some years ago. Now, I'm just going to give you some ground rules before I say anything more because I'm likely to forget. Professor Yoreh will be answering questions after his talk, so please enter your questions into the Q&A box, and he will answer as many as feasible at the end of his talk. Now, before we proceed, I'd just like to say a few words about our center and an upcoming event. The Koshitsky Center for Jewish Studies is not only an interdisciplinary research center specializing in the modern and Canadian Jewish experience, it also runs a wide range of academic, literary, musical, and cultural events throughout the year, both online and in person, to which we invite you. Our next major event is the annual Walensky Lectures in Jewish Life and Education, to be held on the 11th of April. This year's theme is Crypto Jews and the Reacquisition of Sephardic Identity in the 21st Century. So I encourage you to sign up for our mailing list or to visit our website for further details about these and other events. Now, I don't need to tell you that there's a horrible war going on between Israel and Hamas, and it's something that we can't overlook. Nonetheless, there are other issues that we face, issues that will continue after this war, that we can't ignore. One of them is, of course, the environment, a perennial concern throughout the world, but particularly in such a fragile region as the Middle East. It's my great pleasure to invite Professor Yoreh to speak about Jewish environmentalism, particularly in Israel, in his talk today. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Professor Tanhum Yoreh.
Thank you so much, Kalman. It's a great pleasure to be here, and especially considering my roots at York University and with the Center for Jewish Studies. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so this is an ongoing study that is part of my research program at University of Toronto at the School of the Environment. And this particular aspect is a study of Jewish environmentalism, generally speaking, with my colleague Itai Greenspan, who's a professor at the School of Social Work at the Hebrew University, and postdoctoral student Ofir Weinshal Shachar, who's a postdoc at Ben Gurion University. We have ambitions to look at Jewish environmentalism in North America as well, and but this talk will focus on Israel. So the question is it a shared movement? And we'll get a little bit more into what that exactly means as we go along. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Rabbi Ellen Bernstein, who passed away just a few weeks ago, who was one of the founders of the Jewish environmental movement in North America, died prematurely from a set of illnesses and some strokes that she experienced a few weeks ago. I had the honor of meeting her for the first time. I think I'm going to say it was probably in one of the Jaffe institution, the Jaffe movement gatherings in Northern California a few years back, and it was great to chat with her then. And since then, I had the privilege of being on a panel with her She has spent the last little while writing, and just before she passed, she finished a recent book on a new commentary on the Song of Songs. So she's missed, and I'm dedicating this talk to her memory. Okay, so environmentalism in Israel. When people talk about environmentalism in Israel, they often mention this widely successful campaign about not picking wildflowers in Israel. I think the campaign started sometime in the 1950s and is still ongoing. And when people talk about success stories, this is one of them. It is essentially ingrained in every child in Israel that picking wildflowers is taboo. It's something that one should enjoy with their eyes, but not take home with them at the end of their little trek or walk in nature. These are some old school posters. This one's from the 70s. I'm not quite sure when what the date of the one on the right side is, but see that this is, Israel and environmental campaigns. There's a long history. Unfortunately, when people talk about successful campaigns in Israel, to champion one that started in the 50s and shows that some of the successes that have come afterwards have been few and far between. That doesn't mean there aren't any, but as we like to say in the environmental movement, victories are short term and failures are eternal. So I remember being part of a whole number of different campaigns when I was part of Green Course in Israel when I was a student there in university. And, some of those campaigns that did meet success, like preventing areas just outside of Jerusalem from being developed, are now currently up again. New governments, new regime, things get opened up again. And so these whole battles of preserving open spaces, it's ongoing. Nevertheless, Israel does have a pretty robust environmental movement. This is the umbrella organization Life and Environment, Chaim B'Sviva. It's founded in the 70s, and essentially it creates some sort of connecting element, some glue between the different organizations that operate in a wide number of different areas, whether it's conservation or pollution issues or food waste issues, public transportation, the whole gamut. Many of them, in fact, most of them can be found under this umbrella organization. You can even find some faith-based environmental organizations under this umbrella, but often they don't show up here. And so that sort of sets the ground for some of the work that we've done here in this research study to look at faith-based environmental organizations. Now, why is that important? Why should we care? I mean, there's a robust environmental movement in Israel. Who cares if some of them identify as Jewish or otherwise, or come at the environment from a faith-based perspective? Well, here are some images of population growth in Israel and fertility rates. On the right-hand side, well, why don't we start with the left-hand side? On the left-hand side, we see here birth rates for Jewish women based on the sector that they identify with. So on the far left, with the 2.0, we have the secular. And as you move up the scale of religiosity from traditional but not so religious to traditional and religious to simply religious to ultra-Orthodox, and this is an average of all Jewish women, you can see that the birth rate per woman is gradually increases. Where this can be seen most visibly is amongst the ultra-Orthodox with this incredibly high birth rate. And here is this population pyramid, where the blue is ultra-Orthodox, and this greenish yellow is Jewish, but not ultra-Orthodox. And you can see that we have well over a third of the population is under 10 years old. So very quickly, these more religious population groups are going to become the majority groups in Israel over the course of the next couple of generations. So, in other words, when we talk about interests of the wider population in Israel, coming at environmental issues from a faith-based perspective is going to become increasingly important. We also can see here that environment and the religious sectors in Israel have tended not to go together. Here's a study that I conducted with a colleague of mine, Ron Horn, about a decade ago on the distribution of recycling infrastructure in the city of Jerusalem. You can see that the various red and black dots represent recycling bins. The image on the right is on the composition of a particular neighborhood. This is, by the way, the city of Jerusalem. You can see that it's sort of drawn in a pretty weird way, but those are political issues. And you can see here that these dark neighborhoods, the ultra-Orthodox ones, and the light neighborhoods, the Arab neighborhoods, that also happen to be the poorest neighborhoods. If you look at the image on the left, you can see that these communities are by and large neglected from the municipal environmental sorts of initiatives. So simply said, these communities have much less access to recycling infrastructure. And in Jerusalem, the way recycling works is that there are central neighborhood facilities. They don't have door-to-door recycling like we do here in the city of Toronto. When you don't have these facilities in your neighborhood, needless to say, it all gets dumped together in the same bins. Now, if environment is to be a concern in these communities, they need to have access to these types of facilities so that they can start to develop these entryway points into environmental action. Okay, so that takes us to this particular study that we've done in Israel, looking at the different ways in which environmentalism manifests itself from a faith-based perspective in Israel. So what does all that mean? Can't we just say that there's faith-based environmentalism and then there's secular environmentalism, and these are two, overlapping but slightly unique things? The answer is, well, that would be nice if we could do that, but the way in which Jewish environmentalism manifests itself in the different communities and organizations is quite different among the different groups that identify with environment and environmental action through a faith-based lens. And that goes with folks who, say, live in the West Bank, Judea, Samaria, and folks who live in ultra-Orthodox cities and municipalities and different ultra-Orthodox environmental organizations. So what the questions that guide or have guided our study are, one, that we've witnessed a major rise in environmental NGOs in across North America and in Israel, and there are essentially organizations that come to environment through a faith-based lens, saying, which essentially looks like having some sort of moral responsibility for caring for the environment and taking action in order to protect it. And so we see that there are a growing number of said organizations. And so the questions that we asked for this study are, who are these people? Who are these organizations? What are their characteristics? Who are they trying to serve? What sort of values do they have? And ultimately, can we say that the existence of these different organizations actually create some sort of subfield or a faith-based environmental movement in Israel? Now, of course, we can use the term faith-based environmental movement, but those who study social movements, as my colleagues do, so Itai studies social movements, and Ophir was my two co-investigators for this study. Ophir studies organizational theory, and so there are various definitions of what an organization or a set of organizations need to look like in order to become a movement, even though we throw around the term movement pretty loosely, and often these things are described as movements, but so it is still a question. Are they together? Do they form a movement? So what are some of these criteria for being a movement? Well, one is that we need to have an increase in the number of organizations that are affiliated with these types of ideas. And that's certainly something that we do notice. But it also requires an increase in the interaction among the different organizations. So that's one of the things that we're going to be looking at, because that might not be the case here. And then, this emergence of inter-organizational structures and patterns of coalition. So just like I showed you a little bit earlier, that the Israeli environmental movement has this umbrella organization, one that sort of acts as a glue and a networking to create different alliances within the movement and common goals, common cause. That doesn't necessarily exist for the Jewish environmental organizations. And of course, then we have the issues of a unique language and discourse. And we'll see a little bit about what that looks like for these different groups. And then also there's an awareness of the different people who are acting in the space, right? If you are part of a movement, you know that you're not the only person or organization. There are other organizations, and somehow there's some sort of awareness, common cause in order to connect you. So how did we go about our work? So this is a qualitative research study. The first thing we needed to do was identify the organizations that were operating in this space. And so the way we did that was we went to a site called GuideStar, which is essentially a registry of all the nonprofit organizations in Israel. They do have an equivalent in the United States. And here you can see who is filing their taxes, and you can see who has registered themselves as one of the nonprofits or organizations operating in this space. And then what we did was we started to use target keywords to see which ones have identified both as being connected to environment and Judaism in some sense. Of course, once we got this list and we put our keywords together, we had a lot of organizations there that didn't really fit the bill. Folks who use the word environment, not to refer to the natural world, but to say like an organizational environment or an institutional environment. And then, of course, once we started, once we had our initial list and we started speaking with various representatives and leadership of these organizations, we started to also adopt a snowball sampling method where folks would say, oh, you need to, this is what you're looking at, you need to speak with the following person. This person is involved in the following way. So ultimately, we've interviewed over 25 people in the study. I'd say so far, because we can always keep on interviewing more. In addition to these in-depth interviews, we also looked at organizational documents, how folks that the types of materials that organizations are using, the internal documents of how they describe themselves, how they portray themselves to the outside world, etc. And after that, we started doing a thematic analysis of all the data that we gathered, and ultimately, what we came up with was a list of 5 different organizational prototypes, what we can call taxonomies of Jewish environmentalism in Israel, which we describe through the various leaders of the organizations, what we call the entrepreneur characteristics, the organizational characteristics. So what does the actual organization do, not just the leader of the organization? Some of the key values that guide these organizations, and the target groups. Who are they trying to reach through their work? And the different taxonomies that we came up with are global outreach environmentalism, community builders, Haredi or ultra-Orthodox environmentalism, ethno-national environmentalism, and then environmental NGOs with religious initiatives. And the next few slides are essentially going to be a description of what we see the work of these different organizations. So global outreach environmentalism. Here we see in organizations like Tevel B'Tzedek, an Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development. Folks who run these organizations have personas that are known in North America because they are trying to engage in global outreach. So they're by and large run by individuals who have an Anglo background. So Anglo-Saxon is usually the way that Israelis refer to all English-speaking countries. And essentially, what we see here is that by virtue of the fact that these folks are kind of outsiders to Israeli communities because of their Anglo background, that their connection is actually to the outside world. So the organizations are trying to work with an outward orientation. They don't so much work with Israeli communities, even though the folks who do end up volunteering or participating in some of these organizations do happen to be locals, and they don't have to be connected to the Anglo world. And especially for organizations like Tevel B'Tzedek, these are folks who go and volunteer in places like Nepal and elsewhere in the world, in the developing world, and start to bring different Jewish values into play in these different communities that they work with. They connect and affiliate with the broader faith-based environmental movement. That's not the Jewish environmental movement, but they're connected, more broadly speaking, to things that are happening elsewhere in the world. And they're very focused on interfaith partnerships. So, Rav Yonatan Neril, who is the founder and the director of the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development, works a lot with people like Christian theologians on common causes, but much less so within Jewish environmental, within Jewish communities in Israel. Some of the key values that these types of organizations highlight are tikkun olam, which is healing or repairing the world. And they focus on these universal environmental values, and essentially they give them a Jewish lens. Very concerned with social justice, and also highlight things like the complexity of creation. Here's a quote from Rabbi Micha Odenheimer from Tevel B'Tzedek. I wanted to connect Israeli society to the biggest questions in the world of poverty and hunger and connection to the environment. And here you can see that it's essentially, here is an Israeli who is volunteering in Nepal. The community builders. So here's another type of taxonomy. This is one of these prototypes that we're referring to. Here we have these various community or social entrepreneurs. They're trying to build bridges between the environmental world and the Jewish world. They're often environmentalists who happened to have a Jewish background and decided, that it would be meaningful to connect these two parts of their lives. So some of them are fit this model of either they were religious and now are less so, but are still connected to the Jewish ethnic and cultural aspects of their practice, or they used to be religious and now, they used to be secular and now they're religious, and they bring with them this richness that folks who are coming in from the outside sometimes have with them, and they can provide a new lens through which to look at Jewish content. What we see here is this element of a local form of environmentalism. Really what they're trying to do in these organizations and groups is build an Israeli form of environmentalism, right? So that's suitable for Israeli communities, Israeli-born, Israeli folks that don't have this Anglo background. Of course, not exclusively. We do see that some of these are also gearing themselves towards folks who want to, folks who come for, let's say, you're abroad to Israel and want to stay, and they're connected to the environment, and here's a way for which they can be both connected to Judaism and the environment simultaneously. So a lot of what we see here is the production of various educational materials and texts. One of these groups even went and started asking various Orthodox rabbis various Jewish legal questions about the environment in order to develop some sort of corpus of both rabbinical awareness and rabbinical texts to support a growing Jewish engagement with environmentalism. And here, the community building aspect is folks who are really engaged with things like composting, community gardening, just things that people can actually do together in community, and that have both a Jewish and environmental connection. So a lot of this ultimately brings together secular Jews who can also take a look at the environment through a Jewish lens, but not necessarily a halachic one, a Jewish legal one, but through a cultural one. And we see here a lot of universal Jewish messaging that's prevalent in these types of organizations and communities, where it's really about community building and developing relationships. So ben adam lechavero, ben adam lamakom, relationships of humans with each other and then humans with God. And it's about reimagining what Judaism could look like in light of our environmental awareness, or our growing environmental awareness. So that is essentially a rough summary of this group. And here's a quote that sort of gives you some of the motivation behind what we see in this group. So it all started from a sense of emptiness, from a sense that we missed the disappearing past, from a sense of discontent. The children sit for hours in front of their screens. A little bit ironic as we sit here in front of our screens as part of this this webinar. The educational system and its atmosphere, a sense of solitude in cities, lack of connectedness among neighbors, and detachment from Jewish traditions and from nature. It's this feeling that each cares for his or her own business. So the motivation about creating this form of connecting both to community and to environment through Judaism is really what motivates and inspires the folks who are operating in this sphere. The next group is Haredi environmentalism, or ultra-Orthodox environmentalism. Here we have organizations like Lishomra or Shomera. We have Sviva Israel, Haredim LaSviva, and various other groups that we interviewed. Here, we also have this really interesting dynamic with the folks who are operating as the environmental representatives in these communities. They're essentially boundary spanners. They're a little bit sitting in this bit of an odd position where they're kind of like outsiders from the ultra-Orthodox communities because they have this knowledge and this interest in environmental issues, something that you wouldn't get organically growing up in an ultra-Orthodox community. And they're also outsiders from the environmental community because they haven't traditionally been the natural allies or target audiences of the environmental movement in Israel. So they span boundaries, but boundary is really where they sit. But they're important figures insofar as because they're on these boundaries, they actually push to expand the boundaries of what each group is. We describe them as amphibious here. They essentially are trying to translate what they see in the environmental movement and give it a cadence that would be acceptable within the ultra-Orthodox communities. Again, often Anglos are playing a role here, and that also contributes to this outsidedness within the Israeli environment. So, what do these organizations look like? They're mainly deal with things like education. They have a bunch of hands-on programming. One of the more successful and growing organizations is Lishomra, where they take Haredi school children and expose them to things outside of the classroom in the natural world, in agricultural fields, the growing process, etc. But they connect it all to the world of halacha and mitzvot, so that it makes sense to include them in these experiences. What we see also is a strong gender separation with the content that these communities are exposed to. So I'll stop my screen share for one moment and to show you, the types of materials. So here, this is a little educational program developed for ultra-Orthodox school children for boys. And here, what you can see is that there's a teeny little logo from the support from the Ministry of the Environment, but it doesn't even say Ministry of the Environment on it. So you'd have to know that this was their logo. Here it just says, B'nai Brak on it, right? And here you can see the various rabbinical figures that are important in ultra-Orthodox communities. And this is really a book about Jewish ethics and the way in which students are exposed to environmental content is through stories about leaders who, did various ethical things, whether to animals or to their neighbors. And, it's all about different ways in which to connect environmental action to the life of Musar, to Jewish ethics. This here is for these same communities, but for the girls' educational programs. This is a book that's very much connected to the science. So this book says, Avir, Maim, Adama, so air, water, and earth. Here you can see that the logo of the Ministry of the Environment is a little bit more prominent. Here it actually says Ministry of the Environment. And instead of being connected to the world of Jewish ethics, there's a quote from a Jewish text that has some environmental content at the beginning of each unit, and then it goes directly into science. So this is part of the work of these different amphibious characters who understand the communities that they're working with, and if they're going to be able to bring in any environmental content into that world, they need to do it in a way that's acceptable for the leadership of these communities. I'm going to share my screen again. Okay. Here we see that some of the values that are expressed by the leaders of these organizations are things like purity, wonderment, caring for creation. If you're familiar with some of the literature, this is very much ways in which very conservative communities connect with environmental issues. Okay, so this is just an example from a book called Yesh Torah B'Sviva. There's Torah in the environment, developed by one of these amphibious entrepreneurs, Talia Schneider, who teaches permaculture in the Haredi city of Kiryat Yearim. And an indication of, there's Jewish texts, when a fruit tree is cut down, its cry goes from one end of the world to another. So it's really texts that discourage the cutting down of trees, and various quotes here from this more positive image. So this is from the Song of Songs, Mayan Ganim Ber Maim Chaim. So a garden spring is like a well of living water flowing from the Lebanon. So this is some of the example of what would be marketed to ultra-Orthodox communities. Here, when you see a conference that was organized by an ultra-Orthodox environmental organization, none of the panelists are women. They have to think through how they engage with their public in order to make these ideas and issues acceptable to them. Sort of as another aside to the ultra-Orthodox communities, who tend to have a very low level of environmental awareness, but they also have various initiatives within these communities that indicate that there's a lot of potential for environmental championing from a faith-based perspective in these communities. So anyone who's a little bit familiar with the ultra-Orthodox communities is that they're champions of what they call gemachs, which stands for Gmilut Chasadim, or acts of loving kindness. But what it really means is, in this context, is here is like a public forum where people can share space and various other things of connected to social capital, whether it's through things like education or actual items that people would need. This is a way for to indicate there's a circular economy. Less things are thrown out in these communities. There's a much more there's a much more strong culture of sharing with others in these communities. This is an image from the town of Bnei Brak, where you can see that there's, you're just walking down the street, there's like, dozens of different things that you can contribute to that are connected to gemachs across the city. And here's an example of a gemach for wedding dresses. Wedding dress is a huge expense. Here's a way that individuals can get married and not have to outlay much money as a result. Now, are they doing this for environmental reasons? Highly unlikely. Is there a religious background to this? Yes, these are about religious values and about this is how these communities operate. And why are they doing it? Well, part of it is a need. Folks just can't afford a lot of things, and so the community comes together to provide these services for the communities. There's a lot of social capital operating within these communities. And then the question really becomes, did motivations matter at all if the outcome is low environmental impact? But would they frame these as environmental actions? The answer to that is no. Okay, our next group is ethno-national environmentalism. And here we see organizations that don't exclusively, but often operate in the West Bank, in the settlements, in also known as Judea and Samaria. They're often part of the settler movement and connected to a national religious, have a national religious background. Here again, they have very little connection to other environmental organizations. They're very much about a strong Israeli culture, very Sabra, very not connected to the Anglo world. What exactly drives them is a very particular sort of form of environmentalism. It's about knowing the land, about loving the land, about conserving the land, but it's all, this is very much connected to, this is the land of our ancestors. This is the biblical land. This is the land of the sages of the Mishnah. So it's very much engaging with the land through these Jewish texts and knowing the land through these texts. So it is a very concerted form of an applied Zionism, and they champion things like simplicity and low consumerism. There's like a taboo amongst some of these communities to buy new clothing. Like there's like an honor badge to wearing out your shoes type of approach, and it is a very place-based land ethic, and so this is about knowing and loving and therefore protecting the land that you love. So there's an aspect of responsibility, and it's accompanied with a strong form of simplicity. And these folks are motivated by folks like Aleph Dalet Gordon, who was one of the strong philosophical figures of Palestine back in the early Zionist settlements. So here is some indicator for you that this is something that is a bit of a different form of environmentalism, really. And here's a quote from one of the participants in the study. Generally, the idea is to make people more sensitive to the environment, which includes sensitivity to people, to animals, to places around you. The ozone hole, for example, is an extra matter, not the core. So it's not like they say we don't care about it. It's just it's not something that's going to be part of the conversation. That's not how they engage with the environment. And so you can see here, these are images from the Bnei Akiva school of Susia, where they have solar panels on the roof, and they really teach a lot of the values to their students. And our final group here is essentially environmental NGOs who have religious initiatives. So these are the organizations that are definitely going to show up in that list of 133 environmental organizations under the Life of Environment umbrella. Society for the Protection of Nature in Israel, certainly the biggest environmental organization in Israel, the Heschel Center, which has become an increasingly major player in terms of developing leadership skills amongst Israeli society, and so they're big players. Everyone knows who they are, but nobody knows them as Jewish environmental organizations or organizations that have any Jewish element to them, which is somewhat ironic for the Heschel Sustainability Center. Two of the founders of that, Ilan Schwartz and Jeremy Benstein, have both published on Judaism and environment. Heschel, of course, Abraham Joshua Heschel, one of these figures of that's created a theology that has essentially been adopted by a lot of liberal Jewish environmental groups of theology, connecting to the environment through wonderment, and of course, Heschel and championing the Sabbath and things like that. But this is an environmental organization. Their operations are connecting and training people who say are connected to faith-based environmental organizations, but not giving them faith-based content to support their activist initiatives. So, what have we seen from, say, Society for the Protection of Nature in Israel? They've produced educational materials on Judaism and environment. I probably have some on my bookshelf behind me. They've essentially, were given some funding to create materials that could serve a faith-based engaged public. But once that funding ran out, that was sort of the end of their engagement. And of course, it wasn't things that they were able to produce on their own. They had to bring in folks who did straddle these worlds of Judaism and environmentalism and be able to create the content for their organizations. And these organizations, like, if you ask them to say, like, what are the values that motivate your action, there are various universal environmental values, but they're not connected by these organizations to Jewish values. Okay, so getting closer to our conclusions here. So we have some, it's tough to say that we have full conclusions at this point in our study. And even these groups that we found, there's overlaps between the different groups, and will we settle on these 5 different taxonomies of groups? Unclear yet, but this is what we've reached so far. The challenge when we talk about field creation, though, movement building, is that there exists an enormous and possibly an insurmountable tension between the universal environmentalism and particular environmentalism that in this case happens to be Jewish. And here it really is about walking this very fine line between these competing interests and sets of values. So when we look at the environmental side of things, SPNI, Society for the Protection of Nature in Israel, they did create religious content, but when there was an attempt to further that form of engagement and create educational materials that would be used for religious schools, they balked. They said, well, wait a minute, we're not a religious environmental organization. If we start to create this content and have people connect to the SPNI through these religious materials, then essentially we might be painting ourselves into this religious box. And we serve also a very secular set of communities, and we don't want to be described or pegged in by that sort of description. So they rejected that initiative to further develop religious content for different religious schools. On the flip side, so that's sort of the mainstream environmental organizations. That's their challenge. They're worried about religionization, what we call in Hebrew hadaka. And from the flip side, there's this big fear of secularization, but secularization is probably, doesn't accurately describe it for the more religious side of these environmental organizations. So particularly the ultra-Orthodox ones. So here there's a very strong fear of theological inputs, right? When they want to engage with this bridge between the environmental world and their communities, they don't want faith-based content to be inserted into that environmental content. That's like theological meddling for them. They have a very strong sense of what their theology and what their religion and the way they express and identify with their version of Judaism. And for someone to give them a packaged version, even if it's done with the best of intentions, that's already a form of meddling that they're not interested in. And that's sort of, even a non-starter for many of these groups. So they're worried about the environmental movement creating the faith-based content and giving it to them. So there's this tension that exists there that prevents this real strong cross-dissemination and fruitful involvement of this mutual support and movement building. And so they're not really, there's often this hesitation of environmental NGOs from the secular movement becoming involved in environmental initiatives, which is really why we need these amphibious characters to be these social entrepreneurs who walk between the different worlds. But this isn't the only type of thing that creates this tension. Now, we went through these 5 different prototypes. It's not, or taxonomies. It's not that there's a massive number of groups that exist within each taxonomy. There's a limited number of them, and they do focus on different values. They do try to serve different communities. And even, let's say, within the ultra-Orthodox communities, it's like saying, oh, this is a sector. Let's work with that sector. There's the ultra-Orthodox communities from Bnei Brak and from Beit Shemesh and the modern ultra-Orthodox communities. They all have different needs and different interests, and the same tools aren't going to work for each one of these communities. And so part of this is a barrier for movement formation. And so there's very little interaction between the different groups that are operating in the Jewish environmental sector in Israel. There's very little connection to the Jewish environmental movement that's operating in North America. And critically, there's no shared reading list, right? I'm paraphrasing now, but here's a quote from one of the ultra-Orthodox participants in our study, where they said, like, yeah, I'm aware of this various publication that's well known in the literature, but I would never look at that. I would never read that. I would never use that. That stuff is absolutely prohibited. I could never bring someone who wrote someone but affiliates with the Reform movement into my materials and into my work. I wouldn't even look at it, because that would essentially make me treif or not kosher for my communities, and essentially undermine everything I'm trying to do with communities that I'm working with. So there's really no shared reading list that exists among any of these different organizations. Everyone is making their own efforts to create their own reading list almost from scratch. They might draw inspiration from some other things, but essentially, when you think about the resources an organization has in order to engage with the communities and create some sort of educational, public education and outreach, if they have to spend their capital by creating this this reading list and their new materials, everyone has to create the wheel and invent the wheel over and over and over again. That's really not characteristic of what we would call a movement. Beyond that, there's the classic types of things that there's very much inconsistent and unstructured funding for these initiatives. So, let's say SPNI had some funding that was directed by a particular funder for a particular initiative to develop some particular materials in Judaism and environment. But once that funding dries up, folks tend not to have the ability to fundraise so effectively for these types of initiatives. And so there was at one point, about 10 years ago, a peak in the funds that were available. And ever since then, they've declined. And I would say this to sort of send this point home for you, is that, let's say an organization operating in a very particular community, it's like the same barrier that exists in the secular environmental movement of who can we accept funds from? Well, what happens if a chemical company says, oh, we want to, give you a $50,000 grant and put our logo on your initiative as a form of our contribution to the environment? Well, most organizations from the environmental movement say we refuse to accept that money. Here, what happens if there's a pluralistic Jewish organization or funding body or foundation that says, well, yeah, we're willing to fund some sort of initiative here. And here's an ultra-Orthodox organization that says, oh, I really need money to advance my mission and my mandate. But you're a pluralistic foundation. I can't really accept money from you, because if I have to put your logo on my materials, I'm essentially identifying with you, and that's already going to be taboo for the communities that I work with. So there's a real serious problem of being able to keep the funding going for these organizations. And so here we see, again, some of the more common barriers to the field formation. A lot of these organizations are one-person shows. Right? They have, we can probably say that for a lot of different environmental organizations, period, regardless of whether they're faith-based or in Israel or in Canada. They're often driven and inspired by individuals who come in and they start with a lot of energy, and they're just like, I have this great idea, and I really want to work with this community, and then you start to encounter all these challenges and barriers, and you work through them to the best of your ability. But ultimately, once you start to lose steam and you lose energy and the funding dries up, there isn't necessarily an organic person to replace these people in the organizations, and then they start to become less involved and less engaged, and some of them just disappear. Another challenge here is that there's a strong Anglo influence to the faith-based organizations or faith-based environmentalism happening in Israel. And what might become, feel organic and natural to Anglo communities or Olim to Israel doesn't necessarily translate so well into the Sabra, Israeli-born, Israeli-raised Jewish communities in Israel. And because a lot of these initiatives come with this Anglo background, there's been a lot of challenges finding the appropriate translation within the local communities. Many of these organizations are single issue organizations, so that once the issue is dealt with, then they start to wane a little bit. But it also means that there's a challenge to cross-pollination, right? If I deal with environmental pollution affecting a specific community, and you deal with land-based pedagogy, then we probably don't have that much in common, and we might not have the opportunity to work together for in search of common cause. But it also means that a lot of these organizations need to somehow monetize their operations to become independent of these limited funding opportunities. So the ones that are able to enmesh themselves within educational institutions tend to be more resilient. Now, for faith-based environmentalism, the Heschel Center has been a central player. Most people are aware, know, or have gone through training at the Heschel Center and are able to refer to it as a common reference point. So that does speak to the potential of movement formation, and maybe the Heschel Center can operate in some way similar to the way Life of Environment operates for the environmental movement, generally speaking. But again, then we run up against the theological barriers that we've already discussed a little bit. So as a concluding thought, this is ongoing research. One of the positive things that I'm seeing that shows some potential to movement formation is actually through social media and WhatsApp groups, where there's a lot of central players from different parts of the faith-based movements in Israel, regardless of identifying with a particular form of religiosity. So you have people both from the ultra-Orthodox and from the national religious, from the settler movement and from more liberal strands of Judaism, and they're coming together and they are starting to share materials through this different social media platform. So there's potential here that things will emerge and grow as we keep on moving along. So just to illustrate this again in terms of some viewing it, we have the environmental field on one side, we have the religious field on another side, and operating somewhere in the middle are these different Jewish environmental organizations. The challenge is that they remain these individual small circles, and they haven't yet managed to coalesce into things that are convincingly look like a movement on the Israeli side of things. And so we'll conclude there. And thank you very much. Looking forward to reading some of your questions and comments and being in conversation.
Thank you very much, Tanhum, Professor Yoreh. There are only a few questions in the Q&A right now, so I invite you to write any questions or comments if you haven't shared them yet. I'm going to start off by asking a couple of things that are a little bit not in this discussion, but I know they're on your mind. I wanted to ask, first of all, what about other religions in Israel? To what extent are you familiar with their activities for environmentalism, and what are their points of intersection? You described, in some ways predictably, a mirroring of the general cleavages in Israeli society and the difficulty of overarching those cleavages. So I wanted to hear about some of the non-Jewish religious communities. The other question I wanted to ask you about, and then we'll get to the ones in the Q&A, is about the diaspora, or specifically about North America, where I believe you have some familiarity with Haredi-based Haredi environmentalism. I keep thinking of in my office, I have from the New York Department of Sanitation some of their Yiddish literature about recycling, with pictures of Hasidim and and I guess Jewish garbage men with beards also assisting them in learning how to recycle. I wanted to know to what extent are there similarities and differences in the kind of endeavors and challenges that those are faced.
Yeah, thanks for those questions, Coleman or Professor Weiser. So to address your first question, in terms of organizing on or the Muslim or the Christian or the Druze fronts in Israel, in terms of faith-based environmentalism or environmental action, there's essentially nothing going on. I'd love to say that wasn't the case, but that is the case. It's not that to say that these communities are completely divorced from the secular environmental movement, but in terms of their faith-based environmental action, there's not enough to bother even speaking about it. Why is this the case? Well, part of it is that simply environmentalism is less developed in these population sectors in Israel for a whole slew of reasons. Probably part of that image that I showed about the distribution of recycling bins in Jerusalem, where you have essentially the Arab sector and the ultra-Orthodox sector cut off from the ability to recycle. Part of that is about agitation. The people put together this type of infrastructure when they're aware of it and they want it, and that requires some education. So folks who agitated for recycling infrastructure in the Jerusalem context happened to start off as Anglo, right? So they came with their North American sense of a developed, that recycling should just be this obvious service that we have in our cities. And, sort of the people who agitate for it tend to get it. But the people who haven't agitated for it, due to some obvious things like just lack of awareness, haven't agitated nearly to the same extent. If you'll see that it's not, if I showed the image again, you'd see that there are some ultra-Orthodox enclaves in Jerusalem that do have it. And those are actually much more Anglo-Saxon or Anglo enclaves that happen to be they're both Anglo and ultra-Orthodox. So it's more, it was a more obvious connection for them. So part of it is simply lack of awareness and lack of agitation. But something dawned on me. I participated a year ago, in January 23, in a workshop on food waste at University of Haifa. And, Haifa is a pretty mixed city. It's pluralistic, Jews, Muslims, and there was participants from all communities. And I was one of the people presenting on the religious aspects of food waste. And when some of the Muslim speakers came and started to present, and they showed about how they're engaging with their communities, so much of it was connected to the to religious aspects of Islam and how it's so much just embedded as part of their daily life. And so while they weren't seeing this as something that was a faith-based entryway into engaging with various things like food waste and healthy nutrition in Muslim communities, there was a clear opportunity there for for more highlighting of this aspect. But would they have organically have seen this as something that was an obvious faith connection? No, it was just like a cultural thing, and Ramadan, when we have an iftar, there's an increase in food waste, and but the fact that they're talking about Ramadan and the iftar and connecting it to food waste, that for them it was not a religious. This wasn't talking about it from a religious dimension. They were talking about the cultural aspects of Arab societies in Israel. So there's potential there, but it's as yet undeveloped, so I expect to see more of it as these things become more developed, and probably as Islamic things like Islamic environmentalism become more popular in other parts of the world. So that's in terms of item number one. Now, remind me item number two. It was about
Number two
Haredi.
was comparing Haredim in, well, for lack of a better, well, North America, let's say, and in Israel.
Yeah, very different communities working with very different municipal and political structures. So it's but obviously a whole bunch of shared values amongst these communities. And I have published a bunch on environmental attitudes in ultra-Orthodox communities, both in Canada and in Israel. There is, I would say, a general sense of lack of awareness and education on environmental fronts, but there is, again, if we're going to focus on embedded aspects, where there is an embedded environmentalism to existing in life in North America, at least in its urban form. And what I mean by that is, when you finish eating your strawberries that you came in a clamshell box, you're not going to throw them into your gray bin. You're going to throw them into your blue bin, the packaging. Why? Because that's the infrastructure that's available to you, and you don't have to think very much about it, because you just simply it's part of how our society functions in this part of the world. When we're talking about Israeli society, it's not, and so there's an added barrier within those communities of reaching environmental, various forms of environmental action that simply would be obvious to anyone who lives in North America, at least in the cities. But also there's a deeper aspect of culture at play here, where ultra-Orthodox communities in North America are more exposed to modern ideas that they're a bit more cloistered from in the Israeli context, because they're more engaged with the external workforce in North America, whereas in Israel they're able to not do that. I think it's about the age. This is essentially the political discussion du jour in Israel right now, or should the ultra-Orthodox be enlisted in the military? And the way that they don't become enlisted in the military is by studying in yeshivot. And when the Begin government lifted the quotas on how many ultra-Orthodox people are allowed to study in yeshivot, then that number ballooned to tens of thousands today. And when I was looking at the number maybe a decade ago, that number was over 50,000 individuals who are members of these communities who were enlisted in these educational institutions. Now, does that mean that they can then go off and work? No, they have to stay in their study houses. Otherwise, they would be liable for military service up until they reach a certain age. And after you reach a certain age, when you're 40 or 50, your opportunities are a little bit lesser in terms of engagement with broader society that creates some sort of mixing pot of people who aren't just from your community, that North American ultra-Orthodox communities are exposed to from day one, essentially.
Thank you. All right, so let me read what's here in the Q&A. So I think you've kind of answered this, but I'll pose this question and see if you have any additional thoughts. How can we connect existing groups into a hydra, one mind, many offshoots, which share a common goal or respect for the environment? Right? This is, the big theme of your talk. How do we make e pluribus unum? How do we make one out of many?
Yeah, I mean that's it's such an interesting and challenging question, and you'd think that's a whole bunch of smart people operating with strongly inspired and have highly motivated people who really want to make change in their communities through their work and are very much see that protecting the environment is not just an external add-on, it's actually part of their faith expression. Right? And in this case, so it's part of their Judaism. And yet, the theological barriers are really preventing them from being as effective as they could be. They could do more. They could be stronger by being more united. I'm of two minds about this. Like, one, I really appreciate the power of a movement, and there's a lot of capital that comes with being connected to a movement. I also really appreciate the sort of the particularism that comes with these different expressions of environmentalism or environmental action. I've been told by one of my Orthodox respondents here in North America that he never uses the term environmentalism when he speaks with his communities, because that ism comes with all sorts of things that are taboo for the communities that he works with. You talk about environmentalism, you're talking about progressivism, you're talking about paganism, you're talking about liberal values that are not readily accepted by these communities and would immediately disqualify you as someone who can talk on these topics within these communities. So I appreciate that, not the pluralism of praxis, but the pluralism of expression of the different forms of environmental engagement. Folks like Graham Saul, Canadian environmentalist and journalist as well, who's written on this, like in the Canadian context, where he essentially interviewed a whole bunch of environmental leaders in the Canadian context and asked them to say, like, what are you about? What are you fighting for? And there were so many different answers. And he saw this as a form of weakness, that there should be a common cause for folks who are engaged in the environmental community. I see this as a source of strength, where we can tackle this incredibly complex and multi-dimensional project of environmental protection from so many different angles, and ones that take on different meaning for different communities and need to take on different meanings and expressions in different communities. Can they still share some sort of common apparatus? They would be strengthened through that, but it at the same time might undermine this organizational pluralism. So I don't know if that's like just a catch-22, and that's it's a doomed scenario. I don't think so, but obviously there is some common social and organizational capital that could be used in more effective ways if there was this joint aspect of movement formation there.
I'm struck by something in your comments that I never gave thought to before, but it seems appropriate here. Obviously, water has always been an issue in this region. Perhaps less so in some ways because of desalination, more so because of aquifers and the problems that go along with them and the water supply. You know better than I know to what extent is the water supply really in levels of danger we've never seen before. And yet, there's always been some degree of government intervention, as far as I know, in this matter. Um, First of all, I guess the question I would ask is, do different sectors of the of these that you're talking about use water differently? And to what extent has government intervention been effective in managing the water supply? And
Yeah,
is this a
that's a good
model for
question.
environmentalism more broadly? I guess is what I'm asking.
So of course there's Jewish sources that speak about the importance of water, and the organization that actually gathered a bunch of these sources is Friends of the Earth Middle East, Gidon Bromberg, who put together a compendium dealing with some Jewish sources on water preservation and the importance of water in Judaism. Um, from a municipal perspective, water is essentially something that is just, you pay for your water use. The more, which can be problematic, that water is essentially, wasting water is like the purview of the rich. You can afford to be more wasteful with your water. And so I think that naturally speaking, especially with, say, in ultra-Orthodox communities, where there's extreme levels of poverty, that water use people would be mindful of their water use, just based on, we don't waste water, forget about the religious reasons for it, just simple economics. We can't afford to pay our water bills if we use too much. Um, I haven't really seen different approaches based on different religious sectors in Israel, but I'll tell you what I have seen, which to me is a bit disappointing and a missed opportunity, is that ever since Israel started its major desalination projects, and they're one of the world leaders, of course, in desalination, um, there has been less of an emphasis in Israel on the campaign that everyone in Israel grew up with about not wasting water, and chaval al kol tipa, every drop counts. Ever since you could solve the problem by throwing money at it, and taking water from the Mediterranean Sea and putting that into the water supply, there's been a less of an emphasis on chaval al kol tipa. So I've seen much less of that type of propaganda and slogan um, in Israel over the past few years, and it has gone hand in hand with the increase in desalination. That's in part available because of cheaper gas deposits that Israel is now tapping into offshore. So those things are tied hand in hand. But of course, it's not a sustainable solution, because ultimately Israel will run out of that gas, or will need to wean itself off of that gas, but they'll still have a major water issue that will only increase with the rising temperatures and increase in population in that region.
So the last, thank you, first of all. I mean, this is something I've noticed in the last 20 years, precisely that you don't see constant bombardments of information about not wasting water. It's shocking how much that's changed in the last 20 years. So the last comment is just a comment suggesting that a poster contest be sponsored for children to visualize a safe world, and convene a consortium of school teachers from public and religious schools to participate as a way of fostering environmentalism across the various sectors of Israeli society.
I love that idea, and I've seen that idea manifest itself in different communities. The one of the folks who founded an organization called Sviva Israel did precisely this. It wasn't exactly, I wouldn't say precisely. He had an essay writing competition on Judaism and environment that the founder of this organization, Carmi Weizmann, an someone with an Anglo background, who was working with ultra-Orthodox communities in Beit Shemesh and in Jerusalem. And he had this essay writing competition where people were invited to write about topics connected to Judaism and environment. And he actually put together 4 different volumes on this. Now, the fascinating thing is if you, as an average environmentalist with some literacy in Jewish texts, go through these different essays, you would have trouble connecting them to what's common in the world of environmental activism. It's more obscure things about whether you can do a particular halachic aspect that's in a given time frame, or things connecting between neighborly relations, things like that. Sometimes the connection is a bit more obvious, sometimes a little bit less obvious, but really inspired by this same type of engagement, that somebody does a competition, but it died out, and it didn't necessarily make anyone move further along in terms of their environmental awareness in these communities. And the same thing with these school posters and these competitions. The idea is fantastic, but it has to live beyond an initial attempt to pull this off. If you invest a lot of resources in saying, we're doing it, this is the competition this year, we have all these different schools participating, you have to do it the next year as well, and the year after that, and the year after that, and after that, and after that. Otherwise, it was one initiative in 1 year with whatever success it has, and then people start to forget about it. So it has to be built in and sustained as an effort in order to really make a difference amongst the children in these educational institutions. But it's a fantastic idea.
Well, we've reached 1:30. It's time to say goodbye, but I want to thank you on behalf of all of our viewers, our listeners, the Center for Jewish Studies, for joining us today and sharing your knowledge with us. And we hope to hear from you again soon. Thank you. And thank you,
so
everybody,
much for
for joining
having
us
me.
today.